Hello and welcome to News in Depth here on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. We're joined by Adam Yasser. He's news director at TVP World and he's fresh back from the Warsaw Security Forum, a major gathering of top European defence and foreign policy makers and experts. This year, the conference took place as Russia escalates drone and jet incursions, while President Trump says Ukraine can win back all its territory, raising questions about US strategy, European burden sharing, and NATO's future. Adam, welcome. Good to have you back.
Thank you, Ashim.
You've had a couple of very busy days at the Warsaw Security Forum. What were your key takeaways?
Well, I think there were two key takeaways. First of all, you know, these drone incursions, this was on everybody's mind, and people were discussing whether Putin exposed the weakness of the Western defenses, if you will, or whether he woke up Europe to a gap in its defenses, which is actually going to serve Europe well. Some people argued both things at the same time. And the second takeaway, of course, is that, you know, after statements from Donald Trump about Ukraine winning territory back, and after Putin's obvious reluctance to enter into any kind of meaningful ceasefire negotiations, the words ceasefire, peace talks were basically replaced by words war or just on the threshold of war.
Right, so the conversation was heating up, if I can put it like that.
It became very current. You know, usually with these gatherings, the problem is, you know, there are lots of sort of statements, rounded phrases, and the experts talk about different things. But this was very current. This was, you know, this was happening just as these really game-changing events were taking place.
Right. Well, I know that, you know, we were very well represented as TVP World there, and I know you had some excellent conversations, as did some of our other colleagues. I'd like to start with an interview and a soundbite, actually, from General Piotr Błażej. He's a former NATO commander in Europe. Let's hear what he has to say about Russian incursions into NATO airspace.
Russians are testing our systems to learn our rules of engagement. So in reality, you have to be careful about disclosing the details because it's a never-ending story. It's like in Afghanistan when we were having certain standard operating procedures or tactics, TTP so-called. They were learning, they were trying to discover them, and we had to adjust them every so many few months. So same here, Russians are testing the system, our responses, and they are looking for and more innovative, more disruptive ways of showing potentially that they have the upper hand.
Right. So you said just before we listened to that, you said that some saw this as a sign of Russian strength, and others saw it as a sign of weakness. What was your overall opinion on this?
You know, I can only speak about what we heard there, and I think the dominant narrative was that yes, Europe is again caught a little off guard here, shooting $3,000 drones with missiles worth in the millions of dollars. And of course, everyone there agreed, both the politicians and the experts agreed that this is not sustainable. But they also argued that, you know, each time Russia does something like this, tests NATO, it actually helps build resilience. Because NATO actually, you know, democracies tend to be slow and sometimes too deliberative. But at the end of the day, NATO has the potential to respond to these threats. And of course, you know, Putin is just testing. So this is the problem with, and we had the EU Defense Commissioner Kubilius talking to us as well. And he said, you know, it's not war, it's not peace, it's something in between. The Polish Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, at the Warsaw Security Forum called it, you know, new type of war. So people realize that this is serious, but the question of where the threshold for a forceful response is another topic that was raised very often during this.
Right, well, I'm sure it was, and it's something that we talk about quite often here as well. You know, what is the threshold, for example, for triggering Article 5 of the NATO
I think
Charter?
people were more concerned about what triggers, let's say, a shooting down of a Russian plane that stays too long in a NATO country airspace. There was this incident in Estonia where a Russian jet, it took him 12 minutes to leave Estonia's airspace. And you know, some people, they should be shot down. And of course, you know, politicians are now talking that if you keep trying this, at some point, inevitably, a Russian plane can be shot down.
Right.
So, you know, it's a bit of a cat and mouse game here. But the message we got consistently from defense officials, but also from some experts, is that when it comes to the planes, NATO is actually quite well prepared. They have the protocol for this. They know how to warn, how to order to exit. A Russian jet should exit the airspace of NATO country, and they're prepared to shoot. With drones, it's slightly more complicated because it turns out, and you know, Ukraine is showing this, you need a completely different type of gear.
Is there something that Europe can learn from Ukraine's experience? Because they've shown themselves to be expert both at producing, using them aggressively and defending against them.
Well, some military experts were furious because they were saying, you guys have been watching this for 2 years in Ukraine, how Ukraine is incrementally improving their air defenses against such low-cost drones or other projectiles of this sort. And what have you done? Nothing. So there was a bit of pent-up anger at how slow Europe is to adapt. And yes, you're absolutely right. Now it's time to learn from Ukraine. And even today, as we speak, Poland opened a center to train Ukrainian drone operators, but the center will also train NATO troops,
right.
and use Ukraine's experience.
Well, perhaps that is something that Europe and NATO needs.
I'll tell you an anecdote. One defense official, and I'm not going to mention the company, one defense official at the forum told me in an off-the-record conversation, he said, you know, we were surprised how good Ukrainians are using our own military equipment, such as the Patriot systems, the anti-missile, state-of-the-art.
Right.
And he was able to identify the target and whether it's feasible to shoot that target down than the artificial intelligence and the computer that is embedded in that defense system. So when our trainer was there with them and was saying that probably doesn't qualify for shooting down because it will miss or whatever other reason, this guy just pressed the button, and he was right.
Right. So there is space for human thought, human consciousness,
and
even
experience, and war experience, battle experience.
Even in times of AI going in all kinds of directions.
Most definitely.
I'd like to move on, if I may, Adam, to President Trump. Now, he seems, well, he has changed his view on the war in Ukraine in a number of times. But his latest pronouncements are, well, Ukraine can get all its land back. I think there are many things, you know, that tells us. What's your reading into that message?
Well, you know, a lot of people there are used to Trump changing his mind and saying one thing and then 2 weeks later saying something completely opposite. So, you know, I think the sense was we need to take this with a pinch of salt because people realize how hard it would be for Ukraine to actually militarily defeat Russia. But also there was consensus, I think, among experts at the forum and some of the politicians that, yes, Ukraine has built certain capabilities that Russia is trying to imitate or catch up but doesn't have. And if Western support continues to flow at the same rate or at a higher rate than so far, that sooner or later, gradually, Ukraine can actually achieve advantage on the battlefield.
Yes, but with European support.
With the European support.
Was there a sense at the forum, Adam, that President Trump was saying, look, this is a European issue, I'm going to stay in the background, you take more of the burden? Were you hearing that?
It was there, and Michael Carpenter, a senior U.S. diplomat, former Joe Biden security advisor, made that perfectly clear. He said, Trump is trying to put this firmly in Europe's basket, so to speak. He expects Europe to do this, and he's basically saying, what everybody agrees is possible, but America should remain engaged. So he said, but in a sense, he also confirmed that in a sense, Trump has been saying this consistently from the beginning, that Europe needs to take greater responsibility for Ukraine, for its own security. But the main point that, for example, Carpenter was taking away from that Trump U-turn is that Trump finally realized what was obvious to many people before, which is that Trump is not interested in peace. He's not interested in any kind of deal. So that's why the words ceasefire, peace deal, they were sort of shockingly absent from all these conversations. Nobody seriously talked about conditions for peace or for ceasefire. Everybody was talking about what Ukraine and Europe need to win the war.
Yeah, okay, so let's go a little bit deeper into that. Clearly, there's a huge difference in sizes of population, in the available resources between Ukraine and Russia. What can be done to even up the playing field for Ukraine? What can Europe do to support Ukraine in getting its land back?
Well, first of all, I think, again, most experts there agreed that it's a stalemate when it comes to the military situation. So because of the advances in technology, the Ukrainians can successfully compensate shortages of manpower with technological advance. But again, they were saying, but that's not good enough to actually move forward and win territory back. So everyone more or less agrees, even the Ukrainians admit this, that if they were to capture more territory, reclaim territory, it would have to be very gradual. And what Europe can do is continue doing what it has been doing, namely, keep supplying Ukraine with weapons, keep financing Ukraine's budget, which is, Ukraine would not be able to sustain this military effort. Even if it agreed to buy everything, it wouldn't have the money. So the Europeans need to keep paying. And of course, the question of frozen Russian assets came up in practically every speech at the forum, because it seems finally that there is movement. And, I keep remembering this conversation we had here with Bill Browder, the former investor in Russia, who said, sooner or later, the European governments will realize either they need to ask their own taxpayers to pay for this, or they will use Russian assets to fund Ukraine's effort. And I think the momentum for that is gathering.
Right. Well, that I think a lot of people would say is about time.
Right.
Reparations for Ukraine will be due, and I doubt that Russia would be in any hurry to pay them. I'd like to look at it from Putin's perspective, because Michael Carpenter said something else that I found interesting. He said that Putin missed his best chance for a deal early on that would have been disastrous for Ukraine. What did he mean by that?
He meant that, as far as I could understand this, I think he meant that, Trump was so eager for a deal to announce, I brought peace as I promised to Ukraine, that he would have pushed Ukraine to accept a bad deal. A deal under which Ukraine would have to cede territory, perhaps abandon parts of its ambition to integrate with the West. There would be, you remember, the laundry list of Russian demands was pretty long.
Absolutely.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So had Putin accepted that, or even engaged with America in conversation, the pressure would be on Ukraine. So I think Mr. Carpenter is arguing that actually Putin, in his obstinacy, if you will, deprived himself of this opportunity, and gave Ukraine a tactical advantage, because now everybody's talking about Ukraine winning the war rather than ceding territory.
Understood. Although, I mean, Putin has never really demonstrated a willingness for peace on any terms other than his own, which is...
Yes, it was largely Trump's illusion, but look how long it took for him to
realize
to see that.
In the last few minutes that we have left, Adam, I understand that you had a conversation with Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya. She's the opposition leader in Belarus.
Exiled, yes.
Exiled operator. Can we have a watch of that soundbite with that lady? And then I'll come back to you.
Victory of Ukraine will give opportunity to many other post-Soviet Union countries, to strengthen our independence, because Russia doesn't see Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, Armenia as independent countries. They want us to be their satellites, to be like they treat us absolutely as not as children who decided, to choose their future by themselves. No, just return to our common past. But we are sovereign countries. We want to, Belarusians, for example, want to be part of European family of countries, because we historically belong to Europe and we mentally Europeans. So that's why victory of Ukraine will weaken Putin and will strengthen actually aspirations of the nations and strengthen actually European Union.
It sounds as though she's saying that the stakes have just gone up for Putin, because if he loses, his dream of recreating the Soviet Empire is completely shattered. Is that how you read that?
Yes, first I need to make a small statement here. I really admire her for her resolve and steadfastness. But the point she was making to me was clear that, Russia is blackmailing a lot of these former Soviet lands with a mixture of economic, military, covert activities. If Ukraine withstands this war and emerges victorious from it, it will send a very powerful signal. And look what happened in Moldova over the weekend in elections there, where Russia basically lost influence. Look at Armenia, a former Russian reluctant ally, which is moving further and further away from Moscow now. And Belarus and Georgia, unfortunately, seem to be stuck in a vicious circle there. But she obviously draws hope that if Ukraine is victorious, then maybe one day Belarus can also be free.
Right, and not just Belarus, of course. There are other former Soviet countries. Georgia and Belarus are at the moment where we see some backsliding, and when we see Russia being on the offensive and preventing these countries from gaining freedom, basically. The Central Asian former Soviet republics, they're very cautious. They're playing their own game, and they're not as much under Russian influence as, for example, Georgia has become now, despite making having made significant moves towards the Western alignment in the past. But now it's in a sort of with reverse gear, if you will. Yeah, I mean, Kazakhstan has in recent months kind of stated its claim to independence from Russian influence to some extent.
Yeah, the Central Asian countries, and they also watch China, you see, and the US, and Europe. So the Central Asian former Soviet republics, they're playing their cards very carefully.
Right.
And Moscow being engaged in Ukraine, and this is probably a very important point, that Moscow is so engaged in this war in Ukraine, which is draining their resources, which is putting a lot of pressure on the Russian economy and the population, is simply unable to react elsewhere. So, we have these drone incursions in Western Europe. There is a lot of anxiety about this in Western Europe, but the other side of the coin is that Russia's resources are not unlimited either.
Right. So it's not sustainable. Unfortunately, Adam, we have to end our conversation. There's so much more we could talk about. But I would like to remind everybody that for those interviews that we've seen and lots of other interviews from the Warsaw Security Forum, they're all available on our YouTube channel. Thank
and
you
on our
again.
portal. Thank you.
And on our portal. Thank you, Adam. And that brings us to the end of this episode of News in Depth. But stay tuned, there's lots more coming up. Goodbye.